The big secret. Something was stirring among the oil men of Oklahoma back in March 1912. Whispers had started to spread from the small way station town of Cushing, about 70 miles northeast of the state capital, that something big was brewing. One lucky wildcatter might have landed a motherlode of oil and gas in an area that, as of yet, was unexplored. If the rumors were true, then the race was on for a piece of the action. Historian Ruth Sheldon Knowles wrote about how one unlucky land lease buyer had to explain the situation to his boss. I got a call yesterday at the hotel in Cushing from a friend who said that they had struck oil out there. A friend of his was listening on the party line and heard the driller called Tom Slick at the farm where he's been boarding and said that they'd hit oil. Now, the man that he's referring to is Thomas Baker Slim Sr., or Dry Hole Slick as he was known by his fellow wildcatters, after suffering a run of over 12 dud drills which all came up dry. But perhaps this time old Dry Hole had broken his run of bad luck, and every lease man in oil-thirsty Oklahoma City would be swarming over the quiet little town of Cushing, stepping on each other's heads for a slice of the action. The most well-connected scouts scrambled to be the first on the scene. Our lease man was among them. But when he arrived in Cushing on the railway and tried to catch a ride out to the Wheeler farm, still about a 9-mile trip to the east, he ran into an issue. Well, I rushed down to the livery stable to get a rig to go out and do some leasing, and damned if Slick hadn't already been there and hired every damn rig. Not only there, but every other stable in town. They had all the barns locked and the horses out to pasture. Every single wagon and horse in the entire town was booked out for the next 10 days by none other than Dry Hole Tom Slick himself. That's 25 taxis taken out of the game at a cost of $1,125, or more than $30,000 a day. So you know he really thinks he's got something. Nothing like a bit of industrial espionage to separate the men from the boys. This clever trick left the competition stranded in town, stomping their hats into the dirt. More of these vultures swooped in with each train that came into town that day, and they were each left with a choice: go home empty-handed or walk. Our man chose the latter. Dry Hole Slick was always one step ahead. So if you were a scout from a big oil firm looking to snipe some cheap drilling land for your big money bosses, well then you were completely out of luck. Even if you had brought your own notary that day and trudged through the dusty countryside of the farm, the place was on lockdown. Well, you see, sir, that Slick and Schaefer roped off the well to the Wheeler farm and posted guards, and nobody can get near it. But why? Had you gone to the extra effort of beating down the guards and trespassing the farm, it wouldn't have looked like anything special. The drills were quiet and the pumps sat idle, and there wasn't a drop of oil in sight. So what the hell was all the fuss about? Take a closer look, though. Something isn't quite right with the scene. The unmistakable smell of crude oil was in the air, and a layer of fresh dirt covered the area around the derrick. Clearly, Slick and his crew were hiding something. But you can't hold onto a secret like that forever. Eventually, it seeps out through the taverns and blackjack dens and finds its way into the press. On March 21st, 1912, the Cushing Democrat paper heralded the start of a new age for the small town, the age of the Wildcatters. The headline read that a splendid oil find had occurred. Thomas Baker Slick had hit upon a gusher, and had you arrived on March 12th, you'd been met with a 40-foot black pillar shooting upward into the sky, showering the area in liquid gold. This was the start of a Wildcatter legacy, which would see Dry Hole Slick shake his extremely unsexy nickname and become one of the titans of the golden age of oil.
It can't be done, but I was born to run.
Yeah, I was born for this, been through the storm for this. So if I'm wrong for this, then I'll be gone for this. But if I made it this far, then I can't slack now.
You say it can't be done, but I was born to run.
Dark days and dry holes. But it wouldn't be an underdog story without a little bit of hardship. And for that, we have to go back to the beginning of this story. Thomas was born on October 12, 1883, to Johnson and Mary Baker Slick. The family hailed from Clarion, Pennsylvania, not far from the original epicenter of the American oil boom, Titusville. The Pennsylvania oil rush kicked off 24 years before, meaning that the countryside around his hometown was awash with oil derricks by the time Tom was born. It was in PA that he cut his teeth in the industry as a young man, following after his father, but by this point the fields in the original oil boom state were pretty much in decline. Pretty much every patch of the oil-bearing land was accounted for, and big business ruled the roost. If one wanted to make it really big in the oil game, they had to look westward. Texas and Oklahoma were established as the new frontiers in the early 1900s, where wildcatters could strike it rich. Places which the big petroleum firms hadn't yet got a grasp on. By this time, Slick the Younger was working as a land lease buyer and had caught the eye of a wildcatter, Alexander Massey, famous for drilling 25 winning wells in a row down in Kansas. Massey appreciated Slick's straightforward style of negotiating and an eye for a good prospect, later saying, Tom would go out and lease most of the territory as yet unproved or doubtful as to oil prospects, but he'd spread as clean a bunch of leases before a capitalist as you'd wish to see. It was in 1904 when Massey hired the young leaseman under his company, Spurlock Petroleum, with a pretty sweet deal, 25% of the earnings from any land lease he procured. But if I remember my third grade math correctly, 25% of zero is technically still zero. The location of Slick's first defeat was the same place he would later have his greatest success, Oklahoma. Back then, the Western Territory was yet to be incorporated as a state, and much of it was reserved for the displaced Native Americans from the East, or so-called Indian country. 1 year after Massey took Slick into his employ, 2 amateur wildcatters working out of their own pocket drilled down into the oil seep on a Creek Indian reservation, working the rig themselves too, old school style. The find was so massive it marked the start of a new Oklahoma oil boom. The Spurlock Petroleum Company was keen for a piece of the action, so Massey and Slick, along with thousands of other hopefuls, descended upon the town of Tyrone, Oklahoma, to begin their operations out west. Slick set to work acquiring leases for land for farmers and ranchers, while Massey oversaw the technical stuff that just came afterwards. All in all, Tom Slick secured an impressive 27,000 acres of land for his employer to drill on. But when it came time to spud in their first Oklahoma well on the farm of a man called M.C.T. Garden, the local papers were abuzz with the excitement. But the drills went deeper and deeper and deeper and never hit the payload that Slick was praying for. Massey's drill team made it to 2,800 feet deep into the earth before the company ran out of budget. It couldn't continue any further. Tensions between the old oil man and young Slick came to a head after another dry hole in 1907 in nearby Kendrick, and our young hero was kicked to the curb. It's not that he did anything wrong as such. I mean, even the most astute wildcatter could be swindled out of the riches by just sheer bad luck. And if you had worse luck than Slick in those early days, he watched people with half the brains of himself get rich beyond their wildest dreams, and he vowed to keep going until he was a millionaire himself. He half joked that he'd one day be bigger than Rockefeller, saying, well, what's he got that I don't? At this point, the obvious answer was, well, money. Slick wasn't broke, but he was no millionaire either. Still young and single, he decided to up sticks completely and move to Chicago, and where he started fresh with a Schaefer and Smathers Company, an independent firm built on Pennsylvania oil wealth. It came with modest compensation, $100 a month plus expenses, about $2,900 today. But at least it paid the bills. More importantly, it would be the chance he needed to rebuild his reputation, just not quite the reputation he wanted. Slick was sent all over North America by the company, buying leases in Kentucky, Canada, and beyond. He would work out of his horse-drawn buggy office during those early days, offering up attractive deals to landowners who often distrusted the big oil firms like Standard Oil. But while landowners appreciated his straightforward, slightly intense style, his employers were more interested in results. And during those journeys around the continent, Slick racked up a horrific record of 0 out of 10. 10 more dry holes in a row. This is where he acquired the nickname Dry Hole. Well, and incidentally, I was also called that back in my single days, but for very different reasons. It looked as if Dry Hole Slick would be one of the thousands who just never made it, fated to retire with nothing but a little bit of savings in the bank and some nice stories for the grandkids. The big turnaround. It was the winter of 1911 when Slick drifted back into Oklahoma City on the railway, coming full circle to where his career began, to run the ground 7 years before. Things had changed quite a bit in those days. Oklahoma was now the 46th state of the Union, and earlier that year, the city had been granted the title of the state capital. But the chaotic world of wildcatters was the same as ever. Under immense pressure to secure profitable leases, leasemen scrambled over each other, some of them willing to backstab the competition to get them. But a true, dyed-in-wool wildcatter usually wanted to avoid all the unpleasantness that came with the competition by going off the beaten track. This meant holding to unproven land, the sort which historian Ruth Sheldon Knowles calls blackjack country. For Dry Hole Slick, or Mad Tom as some now called him, that meant traveling 35 miles eastward, towards the town of Cushing. The Bristow Record announced Mad Tom's arrival in the area by saying he continues to gamble on wildcat stuff. Few men have stuck to wildcatting longer and harder than Slick and his associates. It is said that he spent $150,000 mostly on dry holes. In today's money, that's just short of $4 million of wasted investments up to this point. So if you had sunk $4 million into a business and you had nothing to show for it, it'd probably be the time to start a new career. Oh, but not Slick. He had a wolf for blood. Papers loved a good underdog story as much as us, so they took pity on this young dreamer and followed his exploits like a minor celebrity. At the same time, the papers were publishing articles entreating Oklahoman landowners to embrace the wildcatter culture, lest they jump ship to Texas, where ranchers were literally begging to have their land drilled on. So when the leaseman's trademark buggy office rolled up to the farmhouse of Frank M. Wheeler, deep into the countryside, flanked by lands owned by displaced Creek Native Americans, his reputation no doubt preceded him. Regardless, the middle-aged farmer was more amused than anything. He had acquired his so-called farm for 65 cents an acre 5 years prior, a vast expanse of rocky ground that he and his family struggled to grow weeds on, never mind crops. But Slick sensed something that ran far deeper than the topsoil. He later said the smell of oil sands was perfume to his nostrils. The move west to Oklahoma had been a miserable mistake for Wheeler, but now here was some fancy guy in a suit saying he could make all of his problems magically disappear by just signing on the dotted line. $1 an acre was the offer, with royalties attached, meaning he could just double his money by letting some oil men poke around his garden a bit. Easy choice, I'd say. Drilling commenced on the Wheeler No. 1 well near the start of 1912 after Slick secured financial backing, with some reports mentioning how those investors soon got cold feet as the first well reached a depth of 2,000 feet with no results. Now, bear in mind, just one of these crapshoot holes could cost up to about $10,000, which is about $300,000 today. Slick was left frustrated. The scent of oil was in the air. All he needed was a little bit more time to find it. So he borrowed a couple of dollars from a friend and hopped on a locomotive to Chicago to enlist the help of his old associate, Charles B. Schaefer, who had apparently already made so much bank he was willing to roll the dice on this madman again. With the backing of an old Pennsylvania Wildcatter, he drilled a second hole on a better spot on the Wheeler farm. Slick endured a tense, months-long wait at a boarding house in Cushing. If he didn't get some results soon, then even his closest allies like Schaefer would probably start returning his calls. But then on March 21st, 1912, it was the lead driller that called him into the boarding house. It had worked. They had struck oil, and a hell of a lot of it. The drill bit had pierced through the earth into a pocket of natural gas, nestled in a stratum of oil-rich sands. All that pent-up pressure from the deep down in the earth sent the oil spewing forth 40 feet above the derrick in a spectacular blowout. The kind that every wildcatter dreams of. But let's not get too carried away just yet. The well only produced 40 barrels a day at the start, which is 74 cents a barrel, meant a yield of about $29, just over $830 today. Good, but not great. Slick's drill bit was just 2 inches into the oil sands, and if you really wanted to get rich, you would be praying for at least a few dozen more feet below. For example, the oil sand layer in Oklahoma's hugely profitable Glen Pool was over 100 feet thick. Going on more than a gut feeling, Slick believed that this was just the beginning, and that whoever was going to first snap up all the rest of the surrounding land leases would be very rich men indeed. So he went straight into combat mode and prepared the Wheeler farm for the siege of the leasemen, which we kicked the story off with. After capping the gusher and spreading fresh dirt on the spilled oil, he secured the site and got on the phone to Schaefer. The money man sent along his top Oklahoma negotiators. After that, Slick cut the phone line at the farmhouse just in case some saboteur decided to spread the word. All of his trickery only managed to stem the flow of competitors for a few days, but it was long enough to snap up all the best land in the area. It really proves the benefit of getting in early when you consider that Slick paid $1 an acre for those first plots on the Wheeler farm, while the latecomers had to fork out amounts as large as $160 to $200 an acre. A 200x on the early bird special enjoyed by our lucky pioneer. Over the following days, the hotels and bars of Oklahoma were abuzz with speculation. Was Cushing really the next big one, or was Slick getting ahead of himself? After all, there was no telling how thick the layer of oil sand was. He wouldn't be the first wildcatter to pop the champagne only for his well to dry up before he finished the bottle. Slick developed that first well further to eventually produce 400 barrels a day. However, the second well drilled there only produced a trickle in comparison. Enthusiasm for Cushing quickly dropped off among the Oklahoma oilmen who started to look elsewhere. In fact, it took a full year and a half after that first discovery for them to cotton on to the potential. That was when Slick and Schaefer drilled 300 feet deeper than before and hit the real motherlode, the Bartlesville Sands, a vast stratum of oil sands which turned out to be one of the largest on the continent. Wells at this depth gushed 100x as many barrels per day as the original, a massive 4,000 to 5,000 barrels a day. Now that's the kind of numbers that command attention. The gold mine that Tom Dryhole Slick discovered on the Wheeler farm would be developed into the Cushing Downright field, the biggest in the entire state until it was surpassed in 1920. As a result, Oklahoma basically ran out of drillers, and derricks were thrown up all over the previously bare countryside. Out of the first 46 drills, only one came up dry, and in 1919, the field was so prolific that it generated a stunning 17% of all U.S. oil. It even accounted for 3% of oil production through that decade. Now you're starting to see why it was worthwhile betting on the success of a wildcatter back then. When they won big. As for the town of Cushing, the discovery brought an oil boom to the area. Reports from those days revealed the flip side of the oil game back then. When the little guys lost, they lost big too. The devil came down to Cushing. As oil mania took hold, a new town called Downright was thrown up seemingly overnight. A single street in a gorge flanked by rickety wooden buildings spreading out on either side, bars, brothels, blackjack dens, and boarding houses. Even this wasn't enough to accommodate the swarms of people descending upon the area. Out-of-state rig workers rubbed shoulders with con men and bank robbers. Prostitutes competed for the attention of laborers and big money investors alike. The smartest sold food and clothes to the population, most of whom were basically trapped in the area as slaves to their meager wages. F.S. Bardier of Kansas City Star visited in person and wrote, "There's a smell of crude oil and gas at Downright that gets into a man's nostrils and causes him a delightful inebriation. The symptoms tending toward a magnification of wealth lying loose around the country." Cushing was so inundated with new arrivals chasing that high that the inns ran out of rooms and started renting out their pool tables as beds. A tent city sprang up along the length of the Wheeler Farm, and over the years, more and more shanty towns sprang up in the vicinities with names like Gasright, Damright, and Allright. If it all sounds like a good time so far, consider this. As tends to be the case when you have thousands of people living in lawless squalor, crime skyrocketed. If you went missing from Downright, nobody would ever notice you were gone. When the huge oil storage tanks near the town were drained years later, human skeletons were found at the bottom. If you didn't end up murdered, you might have taken a stray bullet from some drunk guy with a revolver on Main Street, or been killed in one of the brawls in every other alley, or been blown to pieces in a nitroglycerin explosion, or crushed by a steel girder, or straight up died of good old-fashioned cholera. This was the flip side of all that wealth and glamour enjoyed by the big dogs like Tom Slick. Oil mania could turn you into a multimillionaire or a penniless pauper, and in just as much time. For every one of the former, there were 1,000 of the latter. The hive of vice and villainy was the backbone of the thriving oil trade in the mid-1910s. All in all, 23 oil companies were set up in the area in 1915, drawing a total of 330,000 barrels a day out of the earth at peak production in the spring of that year. At 64 cents a barrel, that's the equivalent of about $5.7 million now. And the greatest individual beneficiary of all that new wealth was, of course, the man who started it all, Tom Baker Slick. When news of his initial success broke, the Tyrone Star wrote, "Our old friend Tom Slick, the oil man, has struck it rich. Slick has been plugging away for several years. He deserves the success, and here's to hoping that it will make Tom his millions." And it did. Just 1 month after his find, his daily royalties were already greater than what he had earned in a whole month as a salaried employee. As the land was developed further, the royalties increased to $250 a day, almost $7,000 today. The landowner, Frank Wheeler, also found himself a very wealthy man. He became a millionaire overnight, in his own right. He could finally escape the patch of barren land for the city. He could even put all 9 of his kids through college. Our man Slick would eventually put Cushing behind him too. Together with Schaefer, longtime collaborator B.B. Jones, and investor Charles J. Reitzman, he formed the High Grade Oil Company. Some bickering over lease rights caused a schism between him and Schaefer in 1913, so he dumped his share in the company to the Prairie Oil and Gas Company, a big business outfit out of Kansas, for $250,000, a cool $6.8 million today. The company's holdings only accounted for a fraction of the land he snapped up for dirt cheap back in 1911, so he continued to develop his holdings independently with nobody to answer to. This suited his style better anyway. Slick always shunned the corporate approach to business, skewing board members and stockholders in favor of real, skin-in-the-game operators like himself. That's exactly what he was. Slick was addicted to the oil game and made a point of brokering his deals personally, visiting sites in person, and making decisions based on pure gut feeling, as wildcatters should. That kind of loose risk management can fray a person's nerves, which is exactly what happened. By 1914, Slick was fed up with the industry and on the brink of a mental breakdown from exhaustion. So he decided to cash out while he still had his wits about him. In September 1914, he sold the majority of his holdings for 10 times the amount he had got for that sale the year prior, $2.5 million, or $68.25 million today. Not bad at all for 10 years of work in the industry. So Slick had finally fulfilled his millionaire ambitions. So what does a filthy rich 31-year-old bachelor do with his time once he retires? Rocket ships weren't quite a thing yet, and cocaine was still something your doctor gave you for a minor headache.
Hell yes.
Honestly, I have no idea how someone could spend that much bank then. Neither did Slick, who said, $2 million is more than I can spend in a lifetime. But what I do know, not from personal experience or anything, is that once you do become filthy rich, any problems you had with the ladies tend to magically disappear. Slick had dedicated his 20s to work and as a result became one of the most eligible bachelors in Oklahoma. After returning from a bit of a round-the-world R&R, he started looking for love. On June 21st, 1915, he married into one of the biggest industrial families in the state. His wife was Bernice Freites, the oldest child of railway tycoon Joseph Freites. The couple would go on to have 3 kids over the next 5 years, Thomas Jr., Betty, and Earl. As for this side of his life, there's not really much to say. Slick was always an extremely private guy who shielded his family from the limelight. The man's not exactly a friend of biographers, is what I'm saying. During that time, he went into business with his father-in-law. Slick used his fortune to invest in the railway industry, forming the Oklahoma Southern Railway, and together he and Joseph Freites established the Slick Townsite Company, to develop oil boom towns across the state. Whenever a new oil boom site sprang up, they'd race to lay tracks to the town and throw up a town similar to Downright to accommodate the influx of people. That's great and all, but once you've lived your life in the cutthroat wildcatter game, rolling the dice with millions of dollars, other industries just don't give you the same buzz. Slick could only sit on the sidelines of the oil business for so long. The big comeback. Following a lifelong cycle of cashing out and then jumping back in again, Slick burst right back onto the scene just as the roaring 20s were getting underway. He followed the same formula as his first success: find fresh land, develop it, cash out while the oil was still gushing. Only this time he had the capital to fund it himself entirely. He pulled off more successful endeavors at the Pioneer Field in Texas, the Slick Carson Field in Kansas, and the Tonkawa and Papoose Fields in Oklahoma. After working himself into the ground again, he cashed out for somewhere around $20 million in 1926, over $300 million today, by staying truly independent, barely keeping any full-time staff, and he was able to reap some jaw-dropping personal wealth from his projects. Very shortly after Slick cashed out for a second time, a fresh boom kicked off that would suck him right back in. In July 1926, a wildcatter down in the town of Seminole drilled a well known as the Fixico No. 1. Making use of the advances in drilling technology, this broke through at a depth of 4,075 feet into the Wilcox Sands, which would soon turn this little town into the largest source of oil in the world for a time. Cue the influx of cutthroats, bootleggers, and pimps out of Cushing. That summer was one of the wildest periods of wildcatter history. The greater Seminole oil fields were made up of over 60 reservoirs of petroleum within just 1,300 square miles. It alone catapulted the U.S. oil reserves into a massive surplus. All of this on Seminole people land, which was, like the Wheeler Farm, had brought nothing but poverty and hardship to the owners until then. Slick Sr. found himself caught up in the hype again that summer and swooped in to secure land leases around the Seminole area. And he did it in his usual cavalier style. One story has it that he had a chance meeting with a landowner on a street corner. Slick recognized the man as some of the other lease buyers had been trying to woo him for a while now. He asked him, "What do you want for that lease?" $100,000, replied the landowner. "It's a sale. Bring your deeds." That's how easy it was to strike it rich during those crazy days. That's a $1.5 million lease sale wrapped up faster than your average drug deal. At its peak, Seminole City oilfield produced 2.6% of the entire world supply, not quite the 3% that was achieved in Cushing, but to be fair, this was 15 years later, and the total world output was considerably higher by then. As any economics freshman can tell you, that kind of massive output isn't exactly sustainable. With a huge spike in supply, prices crashed as low as 15 cents a barrel, while the oil was flowing at its fiercest. For an overexposed oil man like Thomas Baker Slick Sr., that was a terrifying prospect. Historian Louise Welsh wrote that this meant that the conservation movement, as far as the oil industry concerned, started in Oklahoma and largely in the greater Seminole areas. Slick was among the early supporters of regulation designed to stop the oil and gas industry from eating itself. But unfortunately, he wasn't quite able to stop the industry from consuming him. Things were looking rosy for Slick Sr. as the roaring 20s came to a close. He cashed out his Seminole holdings in 1929 for a cool $35 million, or $558 million today, and was well on his way to becoming one of the richest men in the entire world. This was the largest oil sale by any individual at that time. At the time, the total daily output of all of his holdings was estimated at 35,000 barrels, over 700 grand a day, making him the biggest independent operator in the entire USA. Yes, he remained still fully independent and one of the very last oilmen whose interests weren't wrapped up in some kind of complex corporation. His track record with wells was now looking extremely impressive, making those dozen dry holes at the start look like a tiny speed bump on the way to his glory. His most famous gushers were the number 1 Laura Endicott, 4,500 barrels a day, the number 1 Walker, number 1 Franks, 5,000 barrels a day, and the spectacular number 4 Aiken, 10,000 barrels a day. About a tenth of the record for a gusher at the time, but not bad. Now, you might think that 3 cash outs would be enough for our proto-billionaire, especially since he was now in his mid-40s. But as long as Oklahoma kept producing oil, he'd always be drawn right back in. As it turned out, Oklahoma City itself was actually sitting on top of one of the biggest deposits of petroleum in the entire world. Drill sites started popping up right in the urban districts of town. If you looked out the window of the state capitol building, you'd be able to see derricks being constructed right nearby, pretty symbolically fitting for a state which built so much of its wealth on black gold. In photos, Petunia Oil Well, named so because they started drilling through a flower bed, still sits perched on the left shoulder of the state capitol to this day, making it the only capitol building in the world with an actual oil well beneath it, 1.25 miles beneath it to be precise. A couple years after the derrick started towering over the Oklahoma City, Tom Slick Sr. was among the biggest producers active on the field after reinvesting his Seminole profits. He soon had 45 wells being drilled on top of 30 already completed. Once again, he was on the ground making deals, negotiating leases, overseeing drills. Undoubtedly, our hero was now one of the wealthiest men in the world, but how rich? As always, it's tough to estimate the net worth of an oil man when so much of their wealth is wrapped up in leases and future production estimates of a volatile commodity. So the range of estimates is huge, with some claiming he could have been worth up to $100 million at the time. That's almost $1.6 billion in today's money, which would make him tied for 1,931st richest in the world if he were alive right now. But our hero wasn't a young man anymore. The stress it took to build the wealth took a toll on his body. Unfortunately, Slick wouldn't be alive to see the fruits of his most recent labor. In fact, he wouldn't live to see the following fall. An untimely end. On August 18, 1930, all of the hundreds of oil derricks in the Oklahoma City field set idle from 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., the oilman equivalent of flying the flag at half-mast. 2 days prior, Tom Baker Slick Sr. had suffered a massive stroke following surgery and had died at the age of 46. Some blamed all of those years of high-stress living for the king of the Oklahoma Wildcatters' demise. If so, it was a high price to pay, even if it did bring him wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Wealth which Oklahoma Governor William Murray half-jokingly speculated would be enough to clear the state's debts from the inheritance tax alone. As for what happened to his family, they mostly maintained a low public profile, as Slick Sr. had in his lifetime, bar a few exceptions. His son Tom Slick Jr. took up his father's legacy in the oil business, achieving some success and becoming a well-known philanthropist before he started spending his fortune on his true passion, hunting for Bigfoot and Nessie. Jr.'s life was so bizarre that it was almost the subject of a Nicolas Cage movie, Tom Slick, Monster Hunter. I swear I'm not making this up. And lastly, a monument to Slick's industrial legacy still stands today. The site of his breakthrough success, Cushing became a hub of oil infrastructure, known until today as the pipeline crossroads of the world, where prices for American oil are settled daily. Well, that about wraps up the story for Tom Baker Slick Sr., the wildcatter who dove headfirst into the wild world of the Oklahoma oil boom and came up smelling of roses. More than anything, his life is a lesson of perseverance. If at first you don't succeed, try, like 9 more times until you're $4 million in the hole, and then try again. Actually, before I start handing out wildcatter-themed life advice, maybe we should think about that, some of the guys that didn't make it. A moment of silence for the skeletons in the oil tanks, perhaps. Perhaps a better moral of this story in the end is no amount of money is worth your health and or life. I'll leave you with some words of wisdom from the man himself for inspiration, while you can go out and make your own billions. If I strike oil, everyone calls it Tom Slick's luck. But some folks don't recognize good luck when they meet them in the middle of the street. So I've been fortunate, or lucky, whichever you call it. But I've also done a lot of calling good luck to bring in my way.